Cancer helped me to find those things that I like to do again and find a new appreciation for them. Being outside, being in nature, painting on the beach and writing poetry and all of those things. I'm currently 30 years old, living in San Diego with my wife. I'm really big into women's sports, women's soccer, women's basketball. My wife and I, those are our hobbies. Women's soccer got me through cancer last year, watching the games every weekend after treatment. Diagnosed with Lynch syndrome in February of 2023. And I was like, I don't know what that means. I was getting mixed reactions from doctors about it. So I was just like, I'm not paying attention to this right now. Very typical millennial of myself. So my wife and I started talking about family planning. And when I went to my gynecologist, then she was like, okay, you have history of cancer in your family. Let's just do genetic testing, get that out of the way. My mom had breast cancer at 36. My father had prostate cancer really early. I have grandparents that had cancer. So I went into it thinking I was going to come back with a BRCA gene because I was like, breast cancer. My mom was 36. Well, how else do you explain that? Then I have this paper come back and it's telling me Lynch syndrome. And this counselor is telling me oh, just get a colonoscopy at 30. And I was like, I don't even know what any of this meant. There was such little information about Lynch syndrome that I got. And there's multiple genetic mutations with Lynch syndrome. So it's kind of this umbrella of information, you have this thing. And I was like, okay, I don't even know what that means. Thank you. So if it wasn't for talking about family planning and my gynecologist, then I wouldn't have known to do genetic testing. I was getting all of these mixed reactions. And I was like, I don't feel any kind of stability. And so having the Lynch syndrome diagnosis earlier, before my symptoms had really started ramping up, I always tell people Lynch syndrome, the genetic testing is what saved my life because I knew I needed to advocate for more. I knew that Lynch syndrome put me at a higher risk for colorectal cancer. Those were the things I did read out of all of the information I was given. So it was if I didn't know I had that, I may have been all right, well, the doctor doesn't think it's that. And I remember hanging up the call with my primary and saying out loud, oh, she doesn't think it's cancer. But that was already on my mind because I knew I had Lynch syndrome. So it was one of those things that it was, if I didn't have it, I don't know that I would have advocated for myself the way that I did. I've always had tummy probs, and that was the cute, trendy thing was that everybody has. So I was like, oh, certain things just bother my stomach. And then in the summer of 23, I was like, this is more than just that. I had changes in needing the bathroom, going more often or feeling like I needed to go more often. I always kind of had trace blood in my stool, but it was bright red. So everyone was always like, oh, that's hemorrhoids. And I was like, okay. And then it kept happening more consistently. And I was like, that can't be a hemorrhoid all the time. That doesn't make sense. But abdominal pain, all of your really stereotypical colorectal cancer symptoms. And so I had gone to a primary doctor in the summer and she was like, oh, it sounds like IBS, but you can go to a gastro if you want. And I was like, well, I don't want to live, even if this is IBS, this is terrible. I don't want this. The gastro didn't have anything open until November in person. So I waited until November. And then by the time I got to that appointment, I was like, something is really wrong. I don't really care what anybody was going to tell me anymore. I was like, I know that something is wrong. So I went into that gastro appointment and she was like, yeah, it does sound like IBS. And I was like, okay, I have Lynch syndrome. I have blood in my stool all the time. I'm constipated. I can't go to the bathroom. I listed everything out. And I was like, I need a colonoscopy. I have a family history of cancer. I'm not comfortable leaving here knowing that I feel this way and not checking anything. She was like, okay, I think I should be able to get you an early colonoscopy. I think insurance will approve it. And I was like, I don't really care. I need to know, somehow I will figure out the insurance part of it. But the guidelines for Lynch syndrome is to have your first colonoscopy at 30. And I was 29 at the time. And so I was like, I this needs to happen. I need answers. I have medical anxiety. So I knew that about myself going into it. At that point, it was I wasn't even passing stool anymore. It was a mucus, consistency, because it just nothing was moving. And so waiting, it was oh my gosh, I'm not getting an answer. But at the same time, it was if I had gone earlier and my symptoms weren't that bad, if she had told me IBS, would I have been okay. At that point, when I went in November, I was like, something is horribly wrong. This is, I can't, and even if it isn't cancer, I can't live like this. I can't even go to the bathroom. So and I couldn't even sit down. At that point in November, I couldn't really sit well. I was on a pillow all the time. Like I had lower back problems. I mean, there was something very wrong. And so I was able to say to myself at that point, like, I can't just walk out of here and be like, sure, it's nothing, because I know it's not nothing. And so I think, as agonizing as it was definitely like time for me to say to myself, like, mm-mm, I can't go into that appointment and just walk out with nothing. So I went through the whole holiday season, and I don't know, I guess I thought maybe like, oh, it's fine, I'll do it when I'm back. But at the same time, like, things still were progressing, and it was like I have all of these like experiences where I'm like, oh my gosh, like this is getting worse. It was still time. So it was still time for things to like symptoms and stuff to keep kind of evolving. And so I think that was a really odd experience. I think it was more so like I have to do the prep. Like I just have to do it. And I think that was kind of my mindset most of the time, was like the only way out is through, was always something that I would continuously tell myself. So it's like I have to do this. And so like I drank the terrible stuff, and like that was, I mean, my first ever colonoscopy. But I remember saying to myself when I was doing the prep, I can't be naive enough to think that this is nothing. Like, I've lived in this body long enough. There's no way that I can go into this saying like, I think it's going to be fine, because I think in my head I knew, but it was one of those things, if I said it out loud, it made it real, you know? And so it was like I just kind of kept that to myself, but kept saying to myself like, don't go into this like, blissfully ignorant to anything. So I had the colonoscopy on a Friday. I like woke up and whatever, and I got dressed, and they were like, okay, you need to sit here and wait. And I was like, that's weird, but I've never had a colonoscopy. So I'm like, maybe that's how it goes. So I was like sitting there waiting, and the gastro came over to me, and she like bent down at my level on the chair. And I was like, oh, this isn't good. And I like looked at her, and she showed me these pictures, and I'm like, oh my God, what am I looking at? Those are my intestines. And she was like, so I found a mass. I'm like 99% sure it's cancer, but I'm going to send it in for pathology. And I was like, in that moment, that was like, oh, self advocacy works. Like it works, because had I not pushed for this, I would be living with this mass. So yeah, there was a 6 centimeter mass in my rectum. And I went home with the imaging, and she was like, can't do anything until Monday. It's one of those things where it's like, they say the word, and then everything else is like, wah, wah, like peanuts, like everything is just kind of like, um, so I think that's probably I don't know if she said anything else to me after. I don't know if she explained. I vaguely remember getting like a surgeon's like business card, but it was really just kind of like, what's next? Like I was ready for where do I go from here? And like being on a Friday, like I really had to sit. It forced me to sit in the weekend of it all. And like, I think for me, it was like, how do I move forward? Like, I can't, okay, you gave me this information. And so, like, what's next? Like, I didn't not give myself the permission to feel things, but it was like, in this moment right now, like, I need to figure something out. I'm a fixer. That's me. I'm a get this figured out. Like, how do we, so that was very much myself. And I think a lot of that then after was, how do I tell people this? How do I tell my parents and my in-laws and my family and my friends? Like, you don't drop this in a text. Like, there were people that knew I was getting the colonoscopy. So then people were like, how'd it go? And I was like, so I think that's really hard when it's you're now somewhat responsible for letting down the people in your life, because it's not that you're letting them down, not that you did anything personally, but you're dropping this huge thing on them, and then you're then dealing with their reaction to it. I think a lot of the reminders that I would tell myself is that I'm not responsible for their feelings. They can be upset and feel that for me, but I'm not responsible or obligated to sit in conversations where I have to listen to how they feel about the fact that I have cancer. And that's something that I didn't even realize in the beginning. And I wish that somebody would have said to me in the beginning, because I very much took that on as myself. And then I was like, oh my God, all of these people feel this way about it and I can't do anything about it. And you blame yourself in a way, even though you logically can probably talk yourself out of it. But it's still, if you're hearing people continuously, even strangers being like, I can't believe, how did this happen? And, like this like reaction of like trying to make themselves feel better, like they're not going to be me. um, and also, I think being realistic about expectations of other people. I think finding out that somebody young in your life has cancer will affect people differently. And so that might mean support looks different than you thought that they would show up. I was just waiting. And as soon as it came back, what's the stage? That was my focus. It wasn't so much, was it cancer or not? It was, what stage was it? Because that mattered. That mattered on treatment, that mattered on everything that I could look at for the next step, relied on what stage was it. And I think that was waiting for that was the hardest thing. I mean, I think my doctors were like, Jessica, we will we will tell you. I'm like, okay, but you don't understand. Like, how do I sit and live with this? How do I not know what's happening? Like, how do I just like throw caution to the wind and wait? Like that's a crazy thing you're asking me to do. But it was the staging. It was, what do I have to prepare for? That was probably my biggest, like, holding my breath was for the stage, which I think I waited like 2 weeks for, probably, because then we needed to do like an MRI and a CT and a this. And so she said to me, but knowing that, I would like to we're going to follow the clinical trial that they did at Memorial Sloan Kettering here in San Diego. And I was like, okay, like, and she said immunotherapy. I'm like, I've never, that word is newly into my vocabulary, like within the past week. What does that mean? Like, what is that? And so she really explained immunotherapy for me, like broke it down, like told me about why that versus chemo and all of this. And she said to me, you could do some more research on the clinical trial yourself. She said, but they announced this back in 2022, I believe it was the first round, that 100% success rate. And I was like, yeah, sign me up. I was like, I grew up in New Jersey. Memorial Sloan Kettering was the hospital that everybody went to. So like I already knew Memorial Sloan Kettering. So I was like, cool, I'm in. And she was like, I just need to tell you, I've never had a patient on this kind of medication before. She said, I've have patients on immunotherapy, but this exact drug I've never administered before. And she was like, so we'll be learning together. And I was like, cool. And people always ask me now, they're like, what? I would have ran. I would have ran. And I was like, no, because she was straight up with me. She looked me dead in the face and said she didn't have all the answers. And that to me was more comforting than her saying, I have all the answers and I'm going to do it my way. Because then that meant there was room for collaboration. There was room for me to come back and say to her, this feels this way. I'm feeling this. I'm worried about that. Have you read about this? There was an open dialogue there. Had she said, I know everything and this is what you're doing, I would have been like, okay, like, it's no longer, I'm no longer part of my care team. Everybody is taking care of me, but self advocacy taught me I need to be part of my care team. My wife needs to be part of my care team. And so I think all of those things, while to somebody might be like, run, that was more of a reason for me to stay, was because she straight up said, I don't have all the answers. So I was on, it was for 6 months. That was when we went into it. My oncologist said to me, it would be 6 months, 7 infusions over 6 months. So what we did was the first 3 months, and then we would do a midpoint check to see kind of how things were going. If my body wasn't responding, we would pivot to chemo, radiation, and surgery. So when we started the first 4 doses were single doses 3 weeks apart. And then after the midpoint check, we doubled the doses, actually right around the same time. We started the double dose and did the midpoint check and did every 6 weeks. And it was over the summer, so it kind of stretched that out for me where I didn't have to go to the infusion center so often. But it really wasn't a big deal going to the infusion center because it was a 30-minute infusion. It took total an hour, but between waiting in the waiting room and getting to the chair and somebody getting me this, and the infusion was shorter than any of the other stuff. Um, so we did the 7 30-minute infusions over the course of 6 months. And when we did the midpoint check, that was in May, we did a colonoscopy as well as an MRI. And when my gastro went in for the colonoscopy, she said to me that she had never seen anything like it, that the mass was entirely gone. So I was like, oh my God, like, what do you mean? She's like, it's just scar tissue, like, it's gone. And I was like, okay. So I talked to my oncologist after and I was like, are we stop? Like, and she was like, no, we're going to finish it out. She's like, we're going to just, she's like, I'm not deviating here. We're going to finish it out, but it's working. And then I kind of like kept like a symptom tracker in my journal of kind of like what things were. And I would say by the fourth infusion, I was like, wow, like I feel all like back to this going to the bathroom, no blood in my stool. It took to about the fourth infusion for me to not have blood in my stool anymore. That was the one that lasted the longest. But when they went in for the midpoint check, everybody was like, I've never seen this before in ever. And so we finished it out. And then September, I was an ED. Any medication that anybody ever takes started out as a clinical trial. Like, I think that was my thing going into it. I wasn't scared of it because I was like, everything has to be trialed. Like, and so after getting the background of Lynch and immunotherapy and chemo and how that works, and the fact that typically people with Lynch syndrome don't respond great to chemo. And so all I ever knew was chemo, and everybody has that, picture in their head of a cancer patient and what they look like and what. So for me, it was like with immunotherapy, I was like, I'm willing to challenge that. I'm open to trying something that isn't what everybody else is doing because of advancing science. And I think that for me was kind of the point where it was like, yeah, like I'm not, it doesn't scare me. I never thought about it as like a guinea pig or whatever people think that ends up happening with a clinical trial. It was more so for me having Lynch syndrome and being able to be part of something advancing treatment for people like me was really important. So for colorectal cancer screenings, I do a yearly colonoscopy in January, and then I do a sigmoidoscopy every 4 months for the first 2 years. So since it was in my rectum, my surgeon just kind of goes in, looks around, checks to see that the site of the cancer is fine. After the 2 years, we'll talk about keeping the yearly colonoscopy, but then stretching the sigmoidoscopies every 6 months. Again, assuming there's no recurrence or anything. And then because of the Lynch syndrome, we do a yearly skin cancer check. We do MRIs every 6 months for endometrial cancer because Lynch syndrome increases the risk for endometrial cancer. We also do the CTs to check lymph nodes that were impacted. And then we also do breast screenings every 6 months because although there's no like direct correlation of Lynch syndrome to breast cancer, my mom had breast cancer young, and me having Lynch syndrome, my oncologist is like, this is something we need to really keep an eye on. So I do a breast MRI, and then 6 months later, I do a mammogram, and we alternate that all year. So I tell people that I have spring break is March. I have no scans or appointments. June and July is summer break because I don't have any appointments or scans. And then I have the winter break, which is November and December. But otherwise, every other month of the year, I have a scan or appointment of some sort. You have a lot of hard conversations very early in your relationship. We had been together for 10 years, but it's a lot of conversations. It's a lot of conversations about us and our anxieties going into it. Just like I have anxiety, she has anxiety going into scans and appointments. And she was at every treatment with me. And it was, I think the beginning of it was just like, that was blacked out for a while. It wasn't until I was into survivorship and able to look at the beginning part of the year. But once the midpoint check happened, we were both like, okay, we could breathe. Like it's working. Like we're not worried about whether I'm going to have to pivot to chemo, radiation, and surgery. So I think that was a point where the two of us could then talk about other things going on. We've gotten a lot closer. We've gotten a lot more open and vulnerable, and it's really a team effort. I've always wanted to do that. Well, why haven't I done it? Why haven't we done it? Why don't we go to more soccer games? Why don't we go out to dinner when we want to go out to dinner? Yeah, I know money exists, but like who's going to spend my money when I'm not here? Or who's going, like this idea of like you can't do things to that are enjoyable or like leisure things because you have to be saving for this very specific thing. But like at any point in time, life could just change, like really drastically. We have zero control over any of it. And so it's like, well, then fine, I can control doing what I want to do, and that whole like making the decisions with myself in mind, with my wife in mind, rather than like, oh, well, everybody else wants me to do all of these things, or I'm maintaining this relationship, not because anybody gives it back to, pours into it, but because I feel like I have to have this relationship. And then it's like, well, it's not working. So just admit it's not working. There's no, hard feelings, but it's just not working right now. And so like intentionally keeping the people that their relationships are working. And I think every time I think about it, I'm like intention. Like, why am I doing something? Who am I doing it for? And just kind of going from there. I think that that's a really big mind shift that comes with cancer. You're your biggest advocate. You know your body. You're the best. You've the only person to ever live in your body. And that goes beyond cancer. That goes outside of it. That's how you're feeling on a regular basis. We don't talk about like menstrual cycle enough, like things that are off there or things that don't feel right, or advocating for yourself for genetic testing, like knowing more about your family history, like asking those questions. And it's not just advocating with a doctor either. That's talking to family. That's having hard conversations with family and being able to say like, I need to plan this. I need to know this information in order to build my life. And when I tell people about genetic testing, I always tell them, yes, it could come with a diagnosis, but it's a roadmap. It's not medical care is not one size fits all. What works for me isn't necessarily going to work for you, and vice versa. So the only way to know that is to get that information, and the only way to get that information is to advocate for yourself. And so I think that's bottom line, whether it's within cancer or not, being your best advocate.